Hello and welcome to Deep Dive on NewsX World. I'm Kriti Mehta. As the US hurtles towards the 2026 midterm elections, the nation is bracing for what many call the second battle of the ballot box. At the heart of this conflict is President Donald Trump's relentless push for the Save America Act, a piece of legislation that would mandate a rigid national photo ID requirement for all federal elections. To his supporters, it is the ultimate vestige of election integrity. To his detractors, it's a surgical, precision-engineered tool of voter suppression. But beyond the bipartisan ranting lies a calculation based on cold, hard math and three very different versions and visions for the future of the Trump presidency. Today, we are stripping away the rhetoric to look at the strategy. To understand why the White House is obsessed with photo ID, you have to look at the people who don't have them. Data from the Brennan Center and various academic studies reveal a stark ID gap in America. Roughly 11% of eligible citizens, or over 21 million people, do not possess a government-issued photo ID. But in politics, it's not just about the total number. It's about the color of the voter's jersey. The populations least likely to have these IDs are overwhelmingly composed of key Democrat constituencies. Young voters, Gen Z and Alpha, many students in dormitories lack driver's licenses or have out-of-state IDs that the Save America Act would render invalid for voting. Minority communities, Black and Latino voters are statistically less likely to have access to the necessary underlying documents, like original birth certificates required to secure a new photo ID. The elderly and the poor. For those without cars or those living on fixed incomes, the cost and transportation required to visit a DMV constitutes what critics call a modern-day poll tax. But why does this matter now? Let's look at the 2026 midterm opinion polls. Trump's approval rating is currently sitting at low 40s, and the generic congressional ballot shows Democrats leading by as much as 8 to 10% in critical swing districts. In a wave election year, margins are everything. If a federal photo ID law can reduce the turnout of opposition-leaning demographics by even 1 or 2%, it could mean the difference between Republicans retaining the House or losing it in a landslide. Trump isn't just fighting for clean elections, he is attempting to reshape the electorate to be older, whiter, and more rural, the exact demographics where his Make America Great Again message resonates the most. The 2026 midterms are not just a referendum on the presidents, they are a pre-fork in the road for the entire US government. Let's examine the three possible outcomes for the Trump administration. Scenario 1. The gridlock continues. If the midterms result in a split Congress or a paper-thin Republican majority similar to what we see today, the president remains in a state of perpetual combat. Without a commanding majority, the photo ID mandates will be tied up in filibusters and court challenges for years. Trump would be forced to govern almost exclusively through executive orders, which are easily overturned by the next administration. In this scenario, Trump becomes a fighting lame duck, loud but largely unable to pass the structural reforms he promised his base. Scenario 2. The blue wave crashes. This is the nightmare scenario for the Trump administration. If Democrats take both the House and the Senate, the second half of Trump's term becomes a 2-year gauntlet of investigations. A Democratic Congress would likely move immediately to not only strike down federal photo ID requirements, but also mandate nationwide mail-in voting and automatic registration. Every department, from justice to commerce, would be under the microscope. We would see a repetition of the impeachment eras, potentially stalling Trump's entire region and domestic policy agenda. The appointment of conservative judges would grind to a halt, preventing Trump from further cementing his legacy on the federal bench. Let's now come to the third scenario, the Republican supermajority. If Trump's push for photo ID and base mobilization works and the GOP expands its control, we enter the era of the unfettered presidency. The Save America Act would become the law of the land. The federal government would take an unprecedented role in overseeing state voting procedures. With a clear mandate, Trump would have the legislative backing to fund his mass deportation plans and dismantle large swaths of the administrative state without congressional interference. A friendly Congress would act as a shield, potentially passing legislation to codify presidential immunity or curtail the funding of special prosecutors investigating the administration. The final countdown, the push for a federal photo ID law, is the ultimate high-stakes gambit. If Donald Trump succeeds, he may very well secure a permanent electoral advantage for the Republican Party by raising the barrier to entry for his opponent's most reliable voters. If he fails, he faces a Congress that's more emboldened, more aggressive, and more determined to dismantle his legacy than ever before. As we head toward November 2026, the debate isn't just about a plastic card in a wallet, it's about who gets to define the American electorate for the next decade. Let's now welcome Ross Feingold, political analyst from Taipei, in this discussion. Ross, thanks very much for joining us. What's your view of this issue, especially given your expertise in promoting mail voting among expatriate Americans, and what kind of challenges will these laws then create if implemented?
The polls, as you mentioned, do show that there's a high level of support for voter ID legislation. What I think a lot of people, when they answer those polls, don't necessarily realize is across the states, the laws differ significantly. Some states require photo ID when registering to vote, but not necessarily when actually voting. And often voter registration is something you do once, and assuming you didn't move, for example, or change your name, you don't really take further action. You just go to vote whenever there's an election day. Now, other states do require an ID when you do show up to vote at a polling station. Some states have only mail-in voting. They don't even have polling stations anymore. So the situation varies state by state, and that's the way the federal system of the United States was designed. And in fact, the Constitution does say that states do get to regulate how elections are conducted. So we do have a very different situation state by state. And if this was implemented in every state, for people who live overseas, I guess in theory you'd have to mail in a copy of a photo ID, and then there'd be concerns about your information being lost or stolen in the mail. So this is definitely a contentious issue, and it's very much in flux. I mean, it's nearly impossible to say at the moment how this is going to turn out.
All right. Currently, generic midterm polls are, of course, showing Democrats holding a massive 33-point lead among independents. Given that most Americans identify lowering prices as their #1 priority, is the push for the Save America Act a strategic attempt to change the rules of the game because the administration realizes it isn't winning on the real issues?
Not necessarily. Is this the most important concern for voters broadly? Probably not. The usual concerns and the #1 issue for most voters is typically economic considerations. Now, on the other hand, Republicans and President Trump have talked about this issue for many years, and after the 2020 election, they became even more energized about this election. About this issue. It is not going to go away. So whether it's at the state level, where Republicans control the governorship as well as the state legislature, or at the federal level, where at least at the moment the Republicans control the White House as well as both houses of the Congress, these efforts will not go away. They will continue, and this will continue to be a very contentious issue going forward, regardless of what happens with the Save America Act. The one thing we know about the Save America Act is, at least at the moment, we know it passed the House, we know President Trump supports it, but it doesn't look like it will pass the Senate, but that is subject to change.
Ross, Republicans have traditionally championed states' rights. Yet the Save America Act effectively nationalizes election rules, stripping states like Oregon or Washington of their universal mail-in systems. How does the party reconcile this big government federal mandate with its core conservative ideology of local control?
That's a really interesting question. Correct. Republicans have traditionally championed states' rights and a smaller role for the federal government. But on the other hand, this issue of election integrity or election security has become a very, very big issue for Republicans, both at the state level as well as at the federal level. Starting from 2016, President Trump's first presidential campaign, which he did win, and then continuing through the 2020 election, which President Trump lost, and President Trump disputed the integrity of the election. So it does seem for now that this concern about election security or election integrity has taken a seniority over the concern for states' rights. So that traditional approach where we thought of the Democrats as being for a bigger federal government and Republicans being for a smaller federal government, on this issue, that seems to have changed.
All right. And if the grand old party's gamble fails in 2026 results in a blue sweep of both houses, we've discussed how Democrats might pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act in response. Does this weaponization of election law by both sides create a cycle then where Americans' voting rules change every 2 years depending on who holds the gavel?
Certainly, we're seeing nonstop efforts in this regard. So whether that's at the state level with voting rights or at the state level with redistricting of House of Representatives districts, which we're seeing a lot of going on in some of the swing and as well as non-swing states over the past year, or at the federal level. It seems clear that both parties are going to continue to raise these issues at the federal and state level, and that is a change because historically, yes, there have been laws passed at the federal level to encourage voting and also to support state efforts to ensure that voting goes smoothly. And most notably after the disputed 2000 presidential election in Florida, where the ballots were counted and recounted and there was litigation in the courts and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, there was federal efforts to assist the states to facilitate elections and vote counting. But it's not an issue that was raised every single year and on an ongoing basis. It wasn't something that state legislatures or that the Congress federal level wanted to get involved in on an ongoing basis. But that also seems to have changed, that this is now an issue that depending on which party controls a legislature or the United States Congress or the White House, political leaders are going to keep raising and proposing legislation that is favorable to their side.
And finally, Ross, the bill is written to take effect immediately upon enactment, giving state DMVs and election boards zero time to adjust before the 2026 midterms. Is the resulting administrative chaos a bug or a feature of the plan? And could bottlenecks at the DMVs become a secondary form of voter restriction?
Well, the good news in that regard is, and to be fair to state or local election officials, they have so much experience with running elections, whether it's for federal offices like a United States senator or the president, or for the many, many local offices that might be on an election ballot. So even when state legislatures or federal governments change the rules, We see in most places across the United States that voting officials are able to adapt pretty quickly. Now, there are places around the United States where, to the surprise or even the anger of voters, vote counting takes a long time, and it annoys a lot of people. I say, well, how come in one location in the United States it's done very quickly, but in other places it often seems to take many more hours until there is a conclusion and a winner is declared. But for the most part, again, election officials seem to know what they are doing, despite some of the criticisms that they do receive.
All right, Ross, thanks then very much for joining me in this discussion.
Thank you.
Viewers, and that's a wrap up on this edition of Deep Dive. Stay tuned to NewsX World for more news updates.